I didn't notice it at first because I leave early for work and come back late, and normally the driveway is just concrete and routine, something you don't think about until someone else decides it doesn't belong to you anymore. And that's exactly what happened the morning I stepped outside with my coffee and saw a bright white spray-painted line cutting straight across the front half of my driveway like someone had drawn a boundary in the middle of my own property without asking, without
a visitor park
warning, without even pretending to knock on my door first.
This is unbelievable.
At first I thought it was some kind of utility
This
marking
is a
mistake,
violation.
maybe city
The fine
workers
is
prepping for underground cable
$150 per
work,
day.
but then I saw
They
the
should
small
have checked the
laminated sign
deed.
staked into the grass beside it that read, Future Visitor Parking, Greenfield HOA Common Area Expansion. And I actually laughed because it had to be a joke, except no one was laughing and the paint was very real and very permanent. I walked the entire length of that line slowly, measuring it with my eyes, trying to understand how anyone could possibly think half of my legally deeded driveway was common area, and that's when I noticed something even worse. 2 orange cones placed right where I normally parked my truck, effectively blocking my own access, and beyond them survey flags running along the side yard toward the sidewalk. Which meant this wasn't a random mistake, this was planned, mapped, and approved by someone who believed they had authority to redraw property boundaries. Within an hour my neighbor texted me a photo from the community Facebook group where the HOA president had proudly posted an announcement about improving visitor parking availability to enhance property values, and there it was in the comments. A blurry overhead sketch labeling the front third of my driveway as Shared Access Transition Zone, which is a phrase so creatively invented it almost deserves an award. Except the problem was simple. I had purchased this home 5 years ago and the official deed, plat map, and county survey clearly showed the driveway entirely within my parcel lines with 0 easements, 0 shared designation, and 0 community overlay, which meant either they had misread something monumentally basic or they were counting on me not knowing the difference. I didn't storm into the clubhouse right away because anger clouds strategy, and this didn't feel like a simple misunderstanding, it felt deliberate, so instead I went inside, pulled out my closing documents folder, and laid every paper across my kitchen table: deed description, title insurance policy, original subdivision plat, and the certified boundary survey I had commissioned when installing my security cameras 2 years earlier, and line by line I verified what I already knew. The driveway was mine, entirely mine, fully taxed under my parcel ID, and not subject to any recorded HOA easement whatsoever. Then I checked the HOA's governing documents online and found a new amendment passed 3 months earlier labeled Community Access Optimization Initiative, and buried inside that language was a vague clause about temporary repurposing of frontage areas for shared benefit when consistent with association planning authority, which sounded intentionally broad but legally meaningless unless it was supported by recorded easements or homeowner consent, neither of which existed in my case, and that's when it clicked. They weren't claiming ownership, they were manufacturing interpretation. By late afternoon, construction tape had been stretched across the painted line, and a pickup truck from the landscaping contractor pulled up to measure the area, and when I walked outside and asked what they were doing, the foreman casually said, "We're expanding guest parking per HOA directive," as if that explained everything. And I told him calmly that he was standing on private property and that no work was authorized without my written consent. And he paused, looked uncertain, then made a phone call to someone, stepped aside, and returned with a shrug that said this wasn't his fight. 30 minutes later my phone rang and the HOA property manager's voice came through cool and rehearsed, telling me that according to their revised community layout plan, the driveway frontage was part of the association's transitional buffer zone and that refusal to comply could result in fines for obstructing approved development. And I let him finish before asking a single question. "Can you provide the recorded easement document showing association rights over my driveway?" There was a pause long enough to reveal discomfort before he said they would review the file and respond, which is bureaucratic language for we didn't expect resistance. That evening I received an official violation notice stating that I had interfered with authorized community improvements, and that daily fines of $150 would begin accruing if I continued blocking access to the marked area, and I read it twice slowly not because I was confused, but because I wanted to memorize the wording, because once you accuse a homeowner of interference on property you do not legally control, you cross from administrative overreach into potential trespass and coercion territory, and that line is not blurry in court. The next morning, something happened that changed the tone completely. A compact SUV belonging to a visiting family parked directly on the painted section of my driveway, partially blocking my garage entrance, because the cones had been removed overnight and the new sign now read visitor parking, temporary, which meant they had escalated from marking to using, and when I stepped outside and politely informed the driver that the vehicle was parked on private property, she showed me the HOA Notice printed from the community page stating the area was open to guests. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about land anymore, it was about narrative control. They had already told the community it wasn't mine. I didn't argue with the visitor because she wasn't the problem. The problem was the board believing that if they moved fast enough and publicly enough, ownership would become perception, and perception would become compliance. But ownership doesn't transfer by paint line, and perception doesn't override recorded deeds. And as I stood there watching strangers park on concrete I paid to install, maintain, and insure, I made a quiet decision that this would not be handled through angry emails or Facebook comments. It would be handled through documentation. That afternoon I drove to the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of the original subdivision plat and any recorded amendments affecting my parcel number, and what I found was something the HOA clearly hadn't anticipated. A 20-year-old development agreement clause stating that driveway access points were permanently designated as exclusive-use residential improvements not subject to association modification without unanimous owner consent, which meant even if they wanted to reinterpret buffer zones, they legally couldn't touch the driveway without my written approval. And they had already painted it. And they had already invited the public to use it. And they had already threatened fines. When I got back home, another vehicle was parked there. And this time I didn't ask them to move. I took photos. I measured distances. I documented tire placement. Because once you allow use without objection, they argue implied consent. But once you formally contest use and document trespass, the argument flips. By the time my certified letter was marked out for delivery, 3 different vehicles had parked on the painted section of my driveway within 48 hours. And each time I documented it calmly,
this is a violation.
Without
confrontation. It must be corrected
because
now.
Emotion would only feed their narrative while documentation would build mine. And what the board didn't understand was that every tire mark, every photograph, every timestamp was transforming their community improvement into a measurable trespass pattern that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding once placed in front of a judge. The 72-hour deadline I gave them passed without response. But what did arrive instead was another violation notice stating that my obstruction of designated visitor space had triggered automatic fine accrual, and according to their ledger I now owed $300, which would increase daily, and that's when I realized their strategy was clear. Create financial pressure faster than legal correction can move, overwhelm with small penalties and hope I'd settle to avoid hassle. But what they miscalculated was that their entire parking expansion depended on the assumption that my driveway frontage was legally adjustable. And I now had certified county documents stating otherwise. So I escalated quietly. I hired the same licensed surveyor who had done my boundary certification 2 years earlier and asked him to conduct a fresh marked survey with visible stakes placed precisely along my parcel line. And when he arrived and began measuring with professional GPS equipment, neighbors started watching from across the street because nothing attracts attention like a man in a reflective vest placing bright orange markers along concrete that had just been painted by the HOA. And within 2 hours the results were undeniable. The painted white line fell nearly 4 feet inside my deeded boundary, not even close to a shared edge, not even arguable. And when the surveyor handed me the signed certification report, he said something simple that made everything clear. They didn't even check the plat map. That afternoon I emailed the full certified survey, the 20-year-old development agreement clause, and a formal cease and desist notice drafted by a real estate attorney to every board member individually rather than sending it through the property manager, because once personal liability becomes visible, group confidence fractures. And in that notice the language was precise. Continued marking, advertising, or facilitating public use of the driveway constituted intentional trespass and potential civil interference with exclusive use property rights under recorded deed protections. The reaction was immediate. Within hours the HOA president called, her tone no longer rehearsed but controlled and tense, asking why I had involved an attorney so quickly, and I responded that repainting a thicker boundary line after receiving formal objection is not miscommunication, it's escalation, and escalation invites response. And when she attempted to argue that the board had authority under community optimization amendments, I asked her to identify the recorded easement number authorizing driveway modification. And the silence on the other end told me the same thing the survey stakes did. That evening something shifted. The visitor parking sign disappeared. The cones returned. But the white line remained. Which meant they were retreating halfway, trying to reduce exposure without admitting error. The next morning, however, I received a certified envelope from the HOA attorney stating that while the association disputed certain boundary interpretations, they would temporarily suspend enforcement fines pending internal review, which was carefully worded to avoid admitting they had no authority, but suspension wasn't enough anymore, because damage had already been done. Vehicles had used my property, fines had been issued, and public announcements had reclassified my driveway without consent. So I took the final step they never expected. I filed a formal complaint with the County Land Use Office attaching the certified survey and documentation showing the HOA's public advertisement of private property as common space, and I requested official review of potential unapproved land use modification within the subdivision, which triggered something much bigger than an HOA dispute, because county land use departments do not appreciate unauthorized remapping of recorded parcels. Within a week, a county compliance officer visited the neighborhood. They measured. They reviewed plats. They requested association authority documents. And suddenly the narrative flipped completely. Instead of me defending my driveway, the board was explaining why they had painted over deeded boundaries without recorded amendment. 3 days later, during an emergency board meeting, a motion was introduced to formally withdraw the Community Access Optimization Amendment pending legal clarification, and it passed narrowly, not unanimously, which told me everything about internal division, and then came the email no one in the community expected. The previously marked visitor parking area was designated in error and will be restored to original condition. Restored. That word carries weight. The following Saturday the landscaping contractor returned, not to expand parking, but to grind away the white paint line, remove the wooden parking stop, and reseed the grass strip where the sign had stood, and neighbors watched again, but this time the silence felt different, less curious, more aware. The fines were erased from my account. The violation notices were voided. And the board issued a revised policy stating that no frontage modifications would occur without documented homeowner consent and recorded easement verification. But the real consequence wasn't the paint removal. It was the credibility shift. Because once a board overreaches publicly and is forced to reverse under county scrutiny, homeowners start reading documents more closely, asking harder questions, and attending meetings more often, and control built on assumption begins to weaken. A week after restoration, one of the quieter board members knocked on my door and admitted that the expansion plan had been rushed to address parking complaints and that no one had double-checked parcel lines before implementation. And I asked him one question: would it have stopped if I hadn't pushed back? He didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. If I had paid the fines quietly, if I had ignored the paint, if I had accepted temporary repurposing, my driveway would still be functioning as visitor parking today, and perception would have replaced ownership. They thought drawing a line in paint would redraw reality. They thought posting an announcement would redefine property. They thought daily fines would force compliance. What they forgot is simple. Deeds don't change because someone holds a vote. Boundaries don't move because someone brings cones. And common property doesn't expand just because a board says it does. They marked my driveway as common property. Big mistake.